Hello, I'm Nigel Warburton, and this is a podcast of my book, Philosophy the Classics. You can find out more about this book and other books I've written at www.virtualphilosopher.org. And you might like to listen to another podcast I've made with David Edmonds called Philosophy Bites. That's Bites with an I. And that's at www.philosophybites.com. David Hume, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. Apart from Plato, very few philosophers have written successfully in dialogue form. David Hume is the most impressive exception. His Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion is a masterpiece, both of philosophical argument and literary execution. Unlike Plato, who gave Socrates all the best lines, Hume shares the good arguments between the three main speakers, Timaeus, Cleanthes, and Philo, though it is clear that his sympathies on the whole lie with the last of these. The effect is to draw the reader into the debate. The correct view isn't clearly labelled as such and must be discovered through the cut and thrust of the dialogue, a technique he borrowed from the Roman author Cicero. Hume didn't publish this work in his lifetime. He feared persecution from the religious authorities. However, he took great pains to make sure that it was published posthumously. The central topic of the book is the design argument for the existence of the Christian God. The design argument was the mainstay of advocates of natural religion, that is, those who based their religious beliefs on scientific evidence. Natural religion was usually contrasted with revelation. Revelation was the supposed proof of God's existence and attributes provided by the Gospels, with their accounts of miracles performed by Christ, and in particular the resurrection. Hume had already mounted a sustained attack on the claims of revelation in his controversial essay Of Miracles, which appeared in his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. In the dialogues, natural religion comes under fire, though in a more oblique way, since the arguments are given by fictional characters rather than in Hume's own voice. The characters. Although 5 characters are mentioned by name in the dialogues, the debate is all carried by the 3 main speakers, Cleanthes, Timaeus, and Philo. The whole conversation is reported by Pamphilus to his friend Hermippus, but neither of them joins in the philosophical discussion. Each of these 3 main characters defends a recognisable position. Cleanthes believes in the design argument, the view that the apparent design in the universe proves the existence of God. He is then a defender of natural religion. Timaeus is a fideist, that is, he doesn't put his trust in reason, but makes a commitment to faith. Faith that God exists and that he has the attributes ascribed to him. Timaeus also believes that the so-called first cause argument provides conclusive proof of God's existence. Philo, whose arguments are, with one possible exception, the arguments that Hume himself would have been happy to use, is a mitigated sceptic. His principal role in the dialogues is to criticise the positions put forward by the other 2 main characters, and thereby demonstrate that reason can reveal nothing significant about God's attributes. In particular, his critique of the design argument, or argument from design, and of the conclusions which can be drawn from it, is devastating. Nevertheless, he does state that he thinks it is obvious that God exists, and that the important questions are about which attributes God has. Whether this was simply an ironic touch added by Hume to avoid the accusation of atheism is unclear. The design argument. Cleanthes puts forward the argument a posteriori, which is now better known as the design argument. A posteriori arguments are arguments from experience. This is the argument that we can prove the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, benevolent God by considering the natural world. If we look around us, we find that every aspect of the natural world bears the marks of apparent design. It all fits together like a machine. For instance, the human eye is brilliantly suited to seeing. The lens, cornea, and retina seem to have been thought up by a superior intelligence, and the design and the construction of the eye is more skillful than anything made by human hands. The conclusion that Cleanthes draws from this sort of observation is that the natural world must have been designed by an intelligent creator. This creator must have had an intelligence in proportion to the magnitude and grandeur of his work, and so must have been God, as traditionally conceived. In other words, Cleanthes draws an analogy between nature and human artefacts, and on the basis of this concludes not only that God exists, but that he is all-powerful, all-knowing, and benevolent. To lend further support to his argument, Cleanthes uses several memorable examples. If we were to hear a voice speaking intelligently in the dark, we would certainly, and quite reasonably, conclude that there was somebody there. The articulate voice in the dark would be sufficient evidence for this conclusion. The works of nature provide, according to Cleanthes, at least as much evidence for God's existence as would an articulate voice speaking in the dark prove the presence of a speaker. Another example Cleanthes uses is the vegetating library. Imagine books were living things which could reproduce like plants. If we discovered a book with its markings, that's its words arranged in a meaningful order, then we would treat this as conclusive proof of its having been written by an intelligent being. Even if books reproduce themselves, this wouldn't detract from the evidence they present that they contain the traces of thought. Similarly, Cleanthes alleges, we can read intelligence and design in the works of nature. Only a blind dogmatist would deny the evidence that nature provides for God's existence and attributes. Or so Cleanthes believes. However, much of the dialogues is taken up with Philo, and to a certain extent Timaeus, attacking Cleanthes' arguments. Criticisms of the design argument. Weakness of analogy. One argument that Philo uses against the design argument is that it rests on a relatively weak analogy between the natural world, or parts of it, and human creations. Arguments from analogy rely on there being pronounced similarities between the two things being compared. If the similarities are relatively superficial, then any conclusion drawn on their basis will be weak and will require independent evidence or argument as support. If we examine a house, then it's quite reasonable to conclude from its structure that it has been designed by a builder or an architect. This is because we've had experience of similar effects, other buildings, being brought about by this sort of cause, i.e. being designed by a builder or an architect. So far, then, we're on firm ground when we use an argument from analogy. But when the entire universe is compared to something like a house, the dissimilarity between the things compared is so striking that any conclusions based on the alleged analogy between the two can be nothing more than guesswork. Yet Cleanthes treats just this sort of argument from analogy as conclusive evidence for God's existence and his attributes. Limitations on the conclusion. The basic principle that underlies the design argument is that similar effects are produced by similar causes. Because the parts and whole of the natural world resemble a machine in some respects, it's reasonable then to conclude that they originate from the same sort of cause as does a machine, namely intelligent design. Yet if this principle is applied rigorously, as Philo points out, Cleanthes would be forced into an extreme form of anthropomorphism, that is, the tendency to attribute human characteristics to non-human things, in this case to God. For instance, traditional theology teaches that God is perfect. But if we take the analogy between divine and human designers seriously, we can't be justified in claiming that God is perfect, since human designers manifestly are not perfect.